Welcome to this deep dive from Safety One Source.
Glad to be here.
So today, for all of you safety professionals, risk managers, and, well, anyone really looking to boost their safety knowledge, we're tackling something pretty fundamental.
Absolutely. It's about figuring out exactly which OSHA regulations apply when. It sounds simple maybe, but...
it can get complicated fast.
Exactly. So we've pulled together some official OSHA interpretations. The idea is to clear up some common points of confusion.
Right. Unpack that puzzle a bit, because navigating these standards, it can feel like you said, a puzzle sometimes.
Yeah. You've got the big general rules, then these really specific industry standards, and then these interpretations, which are honestly incredibly helpful. They bring it in focus.
Crucial info, especially for the folks listening with Safety One Source who are responsible for workplace safety day in, day out. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the foundation. There's this rule, 1910.5. What's the core idea there?
Well, 1910.5, specifically 1910.5, basically tells you where Part 1910 standards apply geographically.
Okay.
And the short answer is pretty much everywhere. All U.S. states, territories. If you've got a workplace there, Part 1910 is likely in play.
Generally speaking. But there are always exceptions, aren't there?
Always. Section 1910.5b brings up a big one. It says, if another federal agency, not the Department of Labor, mind you,
right,
or maybe a state agency working under the Atomic Energy Act, if they have the specific legal power to set and enforce their own safety rules for certain employees or conditions, then their rules might override OSHA's Part 1910 for that very specific situation.
So it really comes down to who's got the main regulatory authority in those, niche cases.
Exactly. You need to know who the primary regulator is.
Okay, interesting. Now, something lots of safety pros run into. What if it looks like two OSHA standards could apply to the same hazard? How do you know which one counts?
Yeah, that's a common one. 1910.5c1 clears that up. It sets up a hierarchy. If you have a standard that's really specific, tailored to a particular condition, a specific practice, a process that specific standard always takes precedence.
It wins out.
It wins out over a more general standard that might also seem to fit. OSHA gets precise when it needs to.
Specificity rules. Can you give us an example? Make it a bit more concrete?
Sure. OSHA uses the example of ship repair. There's a very specific standard for personal protective equipment, PPE, for ship repairmen in certain areas. That's section 1915.23c3.
Right.
Even if a general PPE standard seems like it could apply, you follow the specific ship repair one. The specific hazards of that job dictate the specific rule.
Okay, that helps. So for you folks in specialized fields listening via Safety One Source, check those dedicated standards first. Makes sense.
Definitely.
But what about the other way around? Can general standards still matter if there is an industry-specific standard?
Oh, absolutely. That's covered in 1910.5c2. General standards apply broadly unless a specific industry standard already covers that particular hazard.
So they fill the gaps.
Kind of like a safety net, yeah. If the industry-specific rule exists but maybe doesn't address, say, noise exposure in detail, then a general standard, like the one for occupational noise exposure, section 1910.95, would still apply to make sure that hazard is covered.
Okay, give us an example there, too.
Think about pulp and paper mills. They have their own standard, section 1910.261.
Right.
But maybe that standard isn't super detailed on noise monitoring or hearing protection specifics. In that case, the general noise standard, 1910.95, would kick in for those mills.
So industry standard first, but general standards back it up to ensure nothing's missed.
Got it. Valuable distinction. Now, another point of potential confusion. Who exactly do these Part 1910 standards protect?
Good question. 1910.5d is pretty clear, even if the language in a standard sounds broad, like it could cover anyone on site.
Yeah.
Under Part 1910, the application is specifically limited to employees and their employment, their place of employment. It's about that employer-employee relationship. Right. Focuses on the workers. Okay, one last bit on this foundational rule. 1910.5f, the deemed in compliance part. What does that mean practically?
This is really key for employers. 1910.5s basically says if you're following all the rules of a specific OSHA standard in Part 1910, then you're considered to be meeting your obligations under the General Duty Clause, that's Section 5A1 of the main OSH Act.
Okay.
But, and this is important only for the specific hazards that specific standard addresses. It's like a safe harbor just for those risks covered by the standard.
So meet the specific standard and you've covered your general duty base for that particular hazard. That clarifies things. Okay, with those basics down, let's look at some real-world examples using these interpretation letters. First up, powered industrial trucks, but in the logging world, what was the issue?
Right. This was back in 1999. The American Pulpwood Association asked OSHA, essentially, does the main training standard for powered industrial trucks, forklifts and such, 1910.17 the old channel, does that apply to log skidders during tree felling?
Log skidders, those big machines dragging logs out.
Exactly. Heavy-duty stuff used right where the trees are coming down.
So what did OSHA say? Does the general forklift training rule apply?
OSHA's answer was pretty direct. They pointed to the specific logging standard, 1910.266.
Ah, an industry-specific one.
Right. And it's designed for the unique hazards of logging, including tree felling. And critically, that logging standard already has its own training requirements for equipment like log skidders. That's 1910.266.
Okay, so if you're a logging company using skidders, you just follow the logging standards training rules.
That's the main takeaway. You only need to comply with the training requirements laid out in the logging standard for that equipment. You don't also have to meet the general 1910.178 standard for those machines.
Makes sense. Avoids confusion, redundant rules.
Exactly. Stick to the one tailored for the job.
Did OSHA suggest anything else, though? Like, could the general standards still be useful?
They did, actually. While stressing the logging standard is the requirement, OSHA suggested employers could still look at the general standard, 1910.178, for maybe extra ideas or best practices when building their training program.
So, helpful guidance, but not a mandatory requirement for the skidders.
Precisely. Rulebook is 1910.266, but 1910.178 might offer some useful pointers.
Good to know. Okay, let's shift gears. Case study 2. General industry rules and oil and gas drilling. What was the question there?
This came up in a 2010 letter. The question was whether the general industry standards, Part 1910, apply during rigging up and rigging down for oil and gas wells.
That's when they're setting up and taking down the big drilling rigs, right? Sounds hazardous.
Very. Lots of heavy equipment, complex operations. So do the general Part 1910 rules cover that?
And OSHA's answer?
It was a definite yes. OSHA clarified that Part 1910 standards do apply to rigging up and rigging down in oil and gas drilling and servicing. They did carve out a specific exclusion, though, for the very initial site prep work, things like leveling the ground, digging trenches, basic excavation. That stuff was seen as separate.
But beyond that initial groundwork, the general safety rules apply to putting the rig up and taking it down.
Exactly. OSHA made it clear that pretty much all other aspects of drilling and servicing, including those critical rigging phases, fall under Part 1910.
Okay.
And they also reminded everyone, as they always do, that even if there isn't a perfectly specific standard for every single hazard, the general duty clause is always there.
Right. That baseline requirement to provide a safe workplace always applies.
Always.
Okay, let's move to telecoms. This company had a bunch of different types of facilities. What was their situation?
Yeah, this 2004 letter describes a telecom company with, the expected switching centers, but also retail stores, call centers, warehouses, admin offices. A real mix.
Uh-huh.
And their question was, does the telecommunications standard, 1910.268, apply across the board to the retail store just like the switching center?
That's a really practical question for bigger companies. So what defines the scope of that telecom standard?
OSHA pointed straight to the standard itself,
Yeah.
1910.268A. It says it applies specifically to telecommunications centers and telecommunications field operations.
And what do those terms mean, according to OSHA?
Well, telecom centers are places like switch rooms, terminal rooms, power rooms, cable vaults. Basically, the operational heart of the network. Field operations is the work done out on the lines, installing, maintaining equipment and structures.
Okay, the technical side of things.
Right. And based on...
Retail stores, call centers.
OSHA said no. Those locations, retail, call centers, warehouses, admin offices, they don't fall under the scope of 1910.268.
Why not?
Because the hazards there aren't really unique to telecommunications. They're more like the hazards you'd find in any similar retail or office environment. General stuff.
And this seems crucial, just because the telecom standard doesn't apply doesn't mean no OSHA standards apply, right?
Absolutely not. OSHA was very clear on that. Those other locations are still fully covered by any other applicable offices. Part 1910 standards think ergonomics, exits, fire safety, electrical in offices, and the general duty clause.
So different rule book maybe, but still under OSHA's watch.
Definitely. The safety responsibility is still there. You just use the appropriate general industry standards.
They also asked about fall protection in those general business spots, didn't they?
They did. They asked if the specific fall protection rule in the telecom standard, 1910 .268G1, which often involves safety belts on poles and towers, applies in their offices or stores?
And the answer?
No again. For those general facilities, you look to the general industry fall protection requirements in Part 1910, not the specific telecom one.
Makes sense. And there's something about scissor lifts, too.
Yeah, using a standard scissor lift with guardrails in those general locations. They asked if people on the lift also needed personal fall protection, like a harness.
Okay. What's OSHA's stance on scissor lifts?
Well, OSHA doesn't actually have a specific standard just for scissor lifts.
Oh, interesting. So what then?
When there's no specific OSHA rule, they often look to industry consensus standards, like ANSI standards.
And what do those generally say about fall protection on a scissor lift with guardrails?
Generally, the ANSI standards don't require extra fall protection like a harness if the lift has proper guardrails installed.
So usually the guardrails are considered enough?
In most typical situations, yes. OSHA likely wouldn't cite an employer just for not using harnesses in that scenario. However,
There's a but.
there's often a but with safety. If the employer knows about a specific hazard, the guardrails don't address. Maybe the manufacturer says use a harness for certain tasks, or there was a near miss, then they might still need to provide extra protection under the general duty class.
So guardrails are the default, but you still have to assess the specific risk.
Got it. Okay, final case study. Electrical safety in NFPA 70E. Huge topic for many listeners. What was the specific question? This 2006 letter asked, does OSHA require employers to mark energized electrical gear for arc flash hazards, specifically like NFPA 70E 2004 says to do it, those specific warning labels?
Right. Those arc flash labels are pretty common now. Is that an OSHA requirement?
According to this interpretation, technically no. OSHA's electrical standards in Subpart S don't have a specific rule mandating that exact NFPA 70E style arc flash label.
Really? Why not?
OSHA explained that their Subpart S rules were based on an older version of NFPA 70E before the specific labeling requirements were added.
Huh. So what does OSHA require for marking?
They require general descriptive markings, voltage, current, etc. under 1910.303E. And they require alerting techniques like signs or tags to warn about hazards under 1910.335B. They see that general info plus good training for qualified workers as key.
Okay, so no mandate for the specific NFPA label in Subpart S. What about flame-resistant FR clothing? Is that required by OSHA for arc flash?
Similar situation.
Yeah.
Because Subpart S is based on that older NFPA 70E, it doesn't specifically require FR clothing for arc flash protection.
Even though modern NFPA 70E versions rely heavily on it.
Right. OSHA hasn't updated Subpart S to explicitly mandate FR clothing based on arc flash risk assessments in the way newer NFPA 70E versions do.
That's surprising given how widespread FR clothing use is. So what's OSHA's main strategy against arc flash in their rules?
De-energization. That's the primary focus in Subpart S 1910.333A, where it basically says turn it off, lock it out, tag it out before you work on it.
The safest way, definitely. Hierarchy of controls.
Exactly. Eliminate the hazard. That's their preferred method.
But sometimes you have to work energized, right? What then?
In those limited cases, OSHA does have rules. 1910.335A1 requires eye and face protection if there's a danger from arcs or flashes.
Okay.
And 1910.335A2 requires shields, barriers, or insulating gear to protect against shocks, burns, and arc flash.
So barriers and face shields are mentioned.
Yes. And they also mention their de minimis policy. It's complex, but sometimes they might allow slightly different protection if other measures, potentially including FR clothing, make the situation effectively just as safe. It's nuanced.
So FR clothing could play a role as part of a larger strategy, even if not explicitly mandated in Subpart S for arc flash.
Potentially, yes, especially under that de minimis concept or as part of meeting the general duty clause.
Did OSHA give any advice regarding NFPA 70 itself?
They absolutely did.
Right.
He strongly recommended that employers consult standards like NFPA 70E for guidance on doing arc flash hazard analyses and figuring out control measures.
So they see it as a valuable resource.
Definitely. They pointed to NFPA 70E's methods for analysis and PPE selection as helpful tools for employers.
So just to be clear, OSHA doesn't enforce NFPA 70E directly.
Correct. They don't enforce consensus standards like regulation.
But they recognize its value and might use it as evidence.
Exactly. They can use it to show that a hazard is recognized in the industry and that feasible ways to fix it exist. This is especially relevant for potential general duty clause citations if a serious hazard isn't covered by a specific OSHA standard.
That clarifies the relationship well. What about general PPE rules like 1910.132 versus the specific electrical PPE rules in Subpart S?
Good question. If both could apply to an electrical hazard, OSHA says the more specific rules in Subpart S take precedence. They're tailored for those electrical risks.
Specificity wins again. And finally, how does the general duty clause fit in if an employer isn't following, say, the latest NFPA 70E recommendations?
OSHA clarified they don't usually use the general duty clause just to enforce NFPA 70E itself.
Okay.
But if there's a serious recognized hazard, like a known arc flash risk, that isn't specifically addressed by an OSHA standard, and NFPA 70E shows that the hazard is recognized and provides feasible ways to reduce the risk, then OSHA could potentially use the general duty clause.
So it's about the underlying serious hazard, and NFPA 70E serves as evidence of recognition and solutions.
Precisely. It's not just about the standard, it's about the hazard and the known ways to protect workers.
Wow, okay. This has been incredibly useful. Really diving into these interpretation letters shows just how nuanced OSHA applicability can be.
It really does.
And for everyone listening, especially you safety pros and risk managers in the Safety One Source community, it's clear that understanding these details isn't just box checking, it's about effective safety.
Absolutely. The main thing to take away is that these standards have specific boundaries. You need to know which ones apply where, and these interpretations are key to figuring that out.
And like we saw, you can't just know the general rules. You have to look for industry-specific ones and then use these letters to clarify those tricky gray areas.
And never forget, even if you can't find a standard that fits perfectly, that general duty clause is always there. Employers have that fundamental duty to identify and fix recognized hazards.
So a final thought for everyone listening. How can you best use this kind of guidance from OSHA, these interpretations, to really proactively strengthen safety in your own specific operations, your industry?
It's worth digging into. Check OSHA's website, look for interpretations relevant to you.
And really think about how these principles apply day to day in your workplace. That's how we build a safer environment for everyone. Thanks for joining this deep dive from Safety One Source.